My name is Patrick Nader, and I'm a member of the webinar team of the Network of Early Career Researchers and Students of ISBNPA, the leading voice in behavioral nutrition and physical activity science. NESI was founded in 2016, and our mission is to promote, stimulate, and advocate the work and research of early career researchers and students in the area of behavioral nutrition and physical activity. If you will be present at ISBNPA 2018 in Hong Kong, please come check out some of our events. We would be delighted for you to join us. This list of activities is posted on our website. In case you want to access this webinar at a later time, please note that we are recording it, and shortly after the webinar, it will be available on our website. You can also access our previous webinars. So today we are using Zoom. In the system, you are all muted except for the speakers and organizers. This prevents noise and keeps us concentrated on the actual talk. However, we would like to give you the ability to interact with us, ask questions, or make comments. The organizers will aggregate the comments at the end of the talk and ask the questions on behalf of the audience. Feel free to ask questions along the way, but remember that we will ask them only after the presentation. Also note that there's a full screen mode. If you click on this icon, you will enter that mode. From our own experience, this is the most convenient way of enjoying the webinar. We have the pleasure of hosting today two very experienced and world-renowned researchers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jonatan Ruiz, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Sports Science at the University of Granada, Spain. Dr. Ruiz was the first Ramón y Cajal Research Fellow in Spain with a sports science degree. Dr. Ruiz will provide a researcher's perspective on high-impact papers. Our second speaker will be Dr. Gregory, a professor of epidemiology, medicine, and physical activity and sports sciences at West Virginia University. Dr. Han has had many achievements in his career, such as being the founding dean of the School of Public Health at West Virginia University. He has also served as the managing editor for Progress in Preventive Medicine and currently serves as commentary editor for the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine. Dr. Han will provide an editor's perspective on high-impact manuscript submission. Now I give the floor to Dr. Jonatan Ruiz.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to share some of our experiences on how to prepare a high-impact paper. I would like to start saying that, writing a paper is like making a puzzle, if we can make this comparison, and where every single sentence of every single paragraph of every single section represent every single piece of the puzzle. And while we are writing the paper, we have to polish the sentence. We have to write every single sentence and to try to connect all the ideas and to feed them very well, as if we were making a puzzle. And as you can see in the image, this puzzle, the pieces of this puzzle do not fit well between each other, and this is what we have to do when we are writing the first draft of our paper. We have to really polish the links between one sentence to the other, so that at the end we have a whole piece where we make a single content, starting from the title and finishing with the conclusion of the discussion section. Two things to start is that one of them is remember that well-written papers are read and also cited. And nowadays we can easily know whether our paper has been cited or not by others. We can use Google Scholar, or we can go to Web of Science, and we can see if our great paper published in a very high impact journal has been cited or not. Imagine that you have a paper in Nature published 20 years ago, and nobody has cited it. So you can imagine yourself how was the impact on the society or on science of your great paper. The other idea I want to transmit is that the reader will never know how long it took you to write the paper. Will never know how long it took you, but it will always be able to appreciate the quality of it. And with this idea, I want to tell you that sometimes writing a paper, it's like a maturation process. It's not something that you do in the afternoon or you do when you wake up in the morning, but it's something that you have to get the ideas mature and to get the ideas well written and well crafted all through the paper, starting from the title and finishing with the conclusions. And it's something that you have to share with your collaborators, with your supervisor, or with your teammate, or with your close lab mate, so that it's getting improved all through the process till the moment of clicking to submit the paper. The first thing to prepare a high-impact paper is to have a good idea. If you don't have a good idea, there's no way to prepare a high-impact paper. And ideas do not come from the sky. They don't rain. Ideas come from reading. You have to read a lot to get good ideas. Once you have a good idea, or you believe you have a good idea, you have to check, you have to be sure that the idea is novel, that nobody else has had this idea before. Or maybe they have had a similar idea, but your idea is like getting a little bit more advanced in some dimensions. Another important thing is that you should try to cover or to answer big questions, and your idea should be of importance from your area of study. Clinical perspective, from a public health perspective, from an educational perspective, from a sociological perspective. You should try to give some new advances on the subject you are working on. And somehow the society should be able to acknowledge the scientific merit of developing such idea. This is also very important to have when you are preparing a high impact paper. And remember that the idea or to hold your idea on that this question has not been done before. Remember that this is not a scientific reason to conduct a study. You should try to answer a research question. You should have a research reason to conduct a study. Besides or beyond that, nobody has done it before, because maybe nobody has done it before because it was not an important research question. Maybe it was a stupid idea. So you have to really try to find a scientific reason to conduct your study. And once you get your paper published or accepted, remember on beforehand that the title and the abstract might be of great importance and can help your work be found also. So that's because remember that the first thing that the reader reads when he's looking for papers is most likely your title on Web of Science or on PubMed. And then if the title is attractive, if the title is catchy, then they will click and they will read your abstract. So this is very important that you really take care of these two sections. 4 questions you should ask yourself when preparing a high impact paper. The first thing is when you have your idea, you have to try to answer what is already known about this subject. What do we know about this? And you should try to state this already in the introduction, to tell the reader, this is what we know about this, and this is my key. This is, and I have identified a very important gap in the literature. And due to the fact that there's an important gap in the literature that I have identified, this is my key question. And this is the what I'm going to add to the literature with my research. And this relates with the third question. What are the new findings? What I'm going to add new to the literature that it was not known before my research was conducted. And last but not least, how my research, how my paper, how my study will impact, for example, the clinical practice in the future. Whether or not my results will change the way of doing things or the way of or the subject I'm working on. This is also very important. And I have to try, and I have to be able to answer very clearly these 4 questions. What do we know? And what are we going to know new after my paper is published or after conducting my research? And how my findings will change the practice, the clinical practice. And to go a little bit more in deep, when preparing a high impact paper, I should state very clearly what is the main outcome of my study. What is the main outcome should be very clear in the paper. And it should be very clear how I'm going to answer the research question. So I have to pick an appropriate study design to answer my research question. And actually, this is one of the key, one of the main reasons to reject the paper, because the study design was not appropriate to answer the research question. And if published, when doing a review, when reviewing the literature, we will be able to identify many studies that try to answer a research question with an appropriate study design. So then we can find another gap. It can be a certain subject where there are certain amount of papers published, but the study design was not the best. So we can build upon our own study based on these poor study designs. And when preparing a high impact paper, we should also take into account that the methodology used to answer the research question should be sound. And ideally, and whenever possible, we should use gold standard methods. Otherwise, if we are not using appropriate methods or sound methodology, then the answer might not be as conclusive as if we are using gold standard methods. Sometimes there might be problems to use gold standard methods because of logistics, because of funding, because of lack of expertise on using a certain technique. But whenever possible, we should try to use standard methodology. Okay. And another important thing when preparing a high impact paper is that we cannot split our findings or our results or our database and think about publishing many different papers. But try to put everything on the same pan, try to put everything in one paper and try to cover all the different answers that can raise from our main research questions. So that we kind of close the circle, kind of make a big paper and no new questions or little questions can raise from our big research question. So, and this salami slicing I'm talking about relates also with the competition to have a long list of publications, or whether I should have less publications but of higher quality. So there's not always a clear answer to that, but remember that it's better to, from my point of view, it's better to have a lower amount of papers published in better journals than double number of papers published in not that good journals. That's my experience. So I will rather recommend to make bigger papers and stronger papers than to split the set of results or the data set into different manuscripts with rather narrow research questions. Another important thing is try to use simple English, easy to read, thing that I always put the same example. Think that the reviewer will read your paper in the beach or in the mountain, and make the reviewer's life easier, and try to put in simple words something very complex. If you are able to put to make simple something very complex, then the paper will be easy to read. You will make the job of the reviewer even easier, and if the paper gets published, then many people will read it. If the paper is very interesting, or the results are very interesting, but nobody can understand, then nobody will cite your paper, because nobody is able to understand, because it's very complex. So try to use simple terms, easy to read terms. And it might be, I have had some students, not many, but some students that they have a very complex ideas, and I like that very much, but only the student can understand what is on his or her head. So I always tell them, okay, try to make the complex very simple. I always tell them, your grandma that doesn't know anything about this should be able to understand your idea. So are you able to put in simple words what you have in your mind? So this could be one idea to make a big paper, to get it published and in a good journal. And think about journals like New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet or Cell Metabolism. Sometimes or most of the times, they try to put in very simple words very complex research questions. So this could be a good example. When preparing a high impact paper, you should also think about the market needed. Who is going to read your paper? And if, whenever possible, think about the person, or think about the journal where you are going to submit the paper, and think about the journal, the target journal or targets journal where you believe your paper can be published. And I always recommend to read a few papers from that journal to learn a little bit how to write, the writing style of that journal. I think that's a good practice. Also think about that. Who is going to read first your paper? And the person who is going to read the paper, if you go to this second line, the person who is going to read the paper is most likely the reviewers. If you are lucky and the editor accept to send your paper out, the reviewer will read your paper to judge its originality, its quality, and also its suitability to the journal. So think that you should not leave many questions unanswered, or many red flags, many hints in the paper, so that the reviewer will not make too many comments. Because if the reviewer makes many comments, the chances to get the paper accepted are lower. So yeah, this is something to take into account. Sometimes I tell my students that because they are very much focused on the reviewer but not on the reader, on the final reader. So sometimes I have to tell them, think not only on the reviewer but also on the reader. But it's true that if the reviewer is able to understand everything you have stated in your paper, they don't raise many questions, then the chances to get the paper published are much higher. Then the other suggestion I would like to make is construct the master plan even before writing your paper. What does it mean, construct the master plan? It means that while reading the literature before writing your paper, it's good idea to have a white piece of paper and to write and to have your ideas of every section of your paper written on beforehand. So, and if possible, to discuss these ideas already with your collaborators or with your supervisor, if possible. So in the introduction, we have 4 ideas, we have 4 paragraphs, four paragraphs, sorry. So the first paragraph should start with this, second paragraph, the idea of the second paragraph will be this, the idea of the third paragraph will be this, fourth will be highlighting the gap, and the 5th paragraph will be the aims. In the methodology, we have to pay attention on this, and this aspect, and the results we will talk about table 1, table 2, table 3, figure 1, figure 2. So from my experience and also working with other people from different countries, is a good exercise to craft the ideas of the paper before writing actually any section of the paper. But what I told my students is, if they are Saturday night inspired, and they should not stop writing, and they should not start doing this plan and wait for Monday or Tuesday to have a meeting with me, but write whatever you feel, knowing that maybe when we have the meeting, they may change some of the sections that they have already written. But if you get inspired, please go ahead and feel free to write as much as you want. But again, to have a plan, it's save a lot of time for you and also for your collaborators. When writing the plan, it also relates with reading the papers. When you are reading the papers, it's a good exercise to make notes on these papers and to mark the papers somehow with numbers, or to highlight the surname of the first author, and to write in your piece of paper to write where did you read something very interesting, or if you read, for example, one paragraph describing very nicely the mechanisms explaining something, please take a note and write it in your white paper, because later on, when you are writing your paper, it might be that it comes to your mind that, okay, this idea that I want to write, I read it somewhere, but I don't know where. And imagine that you have 40 papers in your desk, and you start looking for this paragraph, but somebody was explaining a mechanism. So it is a good exercise to write it in your piece of paper and in this plan on beforehand, so you will save a lot of time later on. And once you have the literature under control, once you have your plan ready and your supervisor or your collaborators are happy with this plan, you can start writing the first draft of the paper. And remember, the first draft of the paper is written to be rewritten. And this happens very often, and especially when you are not very much experienced on writing papers. So you write the first draft, and you leave it for the weekend, and then on Monday you read it again and say, okay, what did I say there? That here? What did I want to say on that other section? Or imagine that you write the first draft, and then you send it to the supervisor. It is very likely that this very first draft comes full of red, with a lot of changes and comments. It's okay, it's right, but I'm just telling you that because sometimes people get frustrated. Another suggestion is that when you give the first draft to your colleague, be prepared to receive comments and accept them, and because sometimes the reaction, from my experience with my students, sometimes they overreact to the comments from their colleagues, because the reaction is, okay, maybe they say you didn't read the paper carefully, because it's very clear that the question doesn't make sense because it's clearly stated in the manuscript. But think that if somebody working with you is making a comment, maybe it's because it was not clear enough in your paper. So accept the comment and try to write things a little bit more clear in your paper. Once you have first draft, second draft, version 10 or 20 of the paper, then you are ready to read it carefully for clarity, readability, and also style, to make sure that everything flows from the introduction, from the title already, abstract, introduction, and also discussion. And work a little bit on editing the paper, not only the text, but also the tables and figures. Because remember that once you submit the paper, remember that there is not a second opportunity to give a first impression. And the first impression that the editors receive, it's very important, because we are all humans. We are not machines. And if the editor receives, or if the editor receives the paper and it looks like very much other papers already published in the journal, then there are higher chances that the editor will send it out for reviewers than if the manuscript doesn't look nice. And because when reviewers or when the editor receive a paper and it's not nicely edited, then what one thing, at least what I think as a reviewer, is that, okay, if the authors didn't pay attention on editing a little bit, or didn't spend a little bit of time on putting things nicely, I cannot imagine how they have done the lab work. I cannot imagine. So it's very important to give a very good impression the first time. Once you have the paper finished, I always recommend to leave it for 3-4 days or for a week. Leave it sleeping there and forget about the paper, and 3-4 days later, 1 week later, print it and read it carefully, because I'm sure that despite having read it many times, having distributed within your collaborations many times, you will find things that you don't understand very well, and it's your own paper. So it's a good activity to leave it for a few days and then read it again and carefully. And then once you submit the paper, the only thing I can tell you is good luck, and that's it. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Greg, it's now up to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the webinar today, and I know there are probably many junior faculty and students that are listening. So it's a great opportunity for me to provide some information and a perspective on how editorial work happens. For many people, especially younger investigators, when you submit your paper, what happens is that that it's sort of a black hole. You submit your paper and you don't really know what happens until all of a sudden you get some kind of response back saying it was needed to be revised, or it was rejected, or if you're very lucky, that it would be accepted. But so let me start off by saying there are different kind of editorial jobs with every journal. There are editors-in-chief, managing editors. Some journals, especially larger journals, have section editors who are experts in a particular area. And so there are many different types of editorial jobs, but the editorial job is all really based on the same idea, which is trying to make a decision on whether a paper should be accepted or rejected. And that, I need to emphasize, that is the editor's job and the editorial board's job. It's not the peer reviewer's job. Peer reviewers, while very important, really provide information. They provide two things. They provide the expert information to make a decision on the acceptability of a paper, but they also provide feedback to the authors. And I think that's very important to remember. The peer reviewers are not making a decision on whether a paper is accepted or not. That is purely in the hands of the editor. But a peer reviewer can be very important and provide very, very specific and significant information on how to improve a manuscript. And I think we lose track of that sometimes. We see peer reviewers simply as individuals who are critiquing and criticizing our work, rather than people who are taking their time and spending effort on trying to improve the manuscript. So again, I come back to the editor on accepting or rejecting a submission. It's the peer reviewer's job to provide expert information to the editor to make that decision, and to provide very important information back to the authors. That information is important to the authors, whether it's accepted or rejected or for that journal, but it's also important to the authors because if it is rejected, I'm sure hopefully the authors will submit it somewhere else, and they can still use that information to improve the manuscript. The editors will do an initial preliminary review of a manuscript, and there are really three decisions that can be made at that point. Number one is the outright rejection, and I'll talk a little more about how that happens and why that happens. Another thing that can happen, and happens very often, is that the manuscript is immediately returned to the author because the formatting isn't correct. The authors haven't paid attention to the online sources on particular types of referencing formatting, on particular types of tables and figures, those types of things. The initial review will just simply uncover some formatting corrections that have to be made, and that means the manuscript will be returned to the authors before any decision is made on whether the paper is acceptable or not for that journal. And lastly, the editor can distribute for peer review. If the formatting looks correct and it seems to be of interest for the readership of the journal, which is very important, it can go out for peer review. So if you reach that stage of peer review and beyond, what is it that you're looking at? And what you need to understand from an editor's perspective is what the author is seeing is not what the editor is seeing. The author has an emotional interest in the work, understands the work. As Dr. Rees said, you don't know how much time was spent working on a paper and writing a paper. It could be months. Some people spend years writing papers. We don't know that as editors. All we know is what's sitting in front of us. Yeah. And so it becomes very important for us. It becomes very important for us to be able to look at a manuscript when it comes in and ask 3 questions. And this is really the big 3 of the initial review by the editor. Number 1 is the submission of interest to the journal's readership? This is more important than how significant the manuscript is itself. It may be a very, very significant paper and be an important paper, but it may not be one that fits the journal's scope and aims. It might be in a field that's somehow distant from what the journal focuses on or what the readership focuses on. So that becomes very important right off the bat. So again, I come back to something that Dr. Ruiz said early on, which is pick your audience. It's very important to know the journal. There's nothing wrong with sending an email or calling the editor and simply saying, I think my paper might fit your journal, just without looking at it, just initially, what is your feeling on it? Is this something that you think might be of interest to the readership? Second thing is the editor will simply look through the paper and look at the quality of writing and presentation. Is it acceptable? Is it at the level that you would expect for that journal? And lastly, does it comply with instructions for authors? Is the formatting correct? Are the quality of tables and figures correct? Do the tables and figures match with what's written in the results section? Is the reference style correct? Are the copyright forms signed and returned? All of those things are very important and not things that the author necessarily is focusing on. The author is probably focusing more on the paper, on the writing of the paper, of the significance and the interest in the science itself, but the editor is looking at it from a very different perspective. It's also important to understand, and I say this up front because it is very important, editors have to protect the time and interest of good, conscientious reviewers. It's difficult to get people to review manuscripts. And the higher they go in terms of the hierarchy of science, the more difficult it is. People are very busy. And so we as editors are going to assess the submission's level of novelty, of impact, and of priority before we send the manuscript out, so that the peer reviewers, if there are issues with the quality of writing, particularly if it's someone who is writing in a journal with a language that isn't their first language, that's often a challenge. If the presentation of the data is poor, if tables and figures are difficult to read and don't really represent the significant points made in the paper, all of those things are things that an editor is going to look at very carefully before the editor sends it out and asks one of his very high quality peer reviewers to look at a manuscript. Why are typical papers, what are reasons that papers aren't accepted by a journal? Let me start off by saying, if you look across science, the studies that have been done show that about 20% of submissions are rejected by the editor during the initial review. So 1 out of 5, and this is higher in some fields than it is other, and certainly it's higher among some journals than others. If you look at the general science, very high quality, high impact journals, Science, Nature, Cell, those types of journals, they get thousands and thousands of submissions every year. Overwhelmingly, those are rejected within the first 24 hours, just simply because it is just too many to handle. And so those manuscripts are going to be submitted somewhere else, usually down what I call cascading, usually down the hierarchy of impact factor. So why are papers not accepted by a journal? Number one, it's not a good fit. It just simply is not appropriate for that journal. And that's something that the author should know before it's submitted to a journal. Second one, something else that Dr. Ruiz pointed out, was the novelty and significance of the work. If there is a lack of novelty, if there's a lack of originality or significance, then the paper is going to be rejected by the author, by the editor before it's sent out for peer review. And keep in mind that saying we were the first to show doesn't mean that something is significant. If it's a trivial question, again, you may be the first one to show it simply because no one else has bothered to show it. And that does happen at times. Another major reason is that there's no theoretical or practical application of the work. There's no place for it to go. It might fit into a body of literature, but it simply has no place to go in terms of follow-up. And if scientists look at a manuscript and they see no theoretical or practical application, it's very unlikely that they're going to follow up that study. And if they don't follow up the study, they won't be referencing that paper, and there won't be any impact of the paper. Another major reason for rejection by a journal is a weak study design. And usually this is something that comes out by the peer reviewer simply because they're the ones who are truly experts in the field. The editors aren't necessarily experts in every area that's included within the journal. So weak study designs, poor or no question. Many papers are rejected simply because there's no obvious question that's being asked. Another big reason is a lack of statistical power. If there's a lack of statistical power, oftentimes what you'll see are negative results, or you'll see where there is a p-factor that's significant, but 10 other p-factors that aren't significant. And so you start getting into these questions about, was there enough statistical power in the study? And oftentimes, unfortunately, what we find with smaller studies and studies that are being done without significant funding is simply there wasn't enough statistical power at the beginning of the study to be able to answer the question that was being asked. And lastly, poor writing or poor organization. I really like Dr. Ruiz's paper where he showed how to lay it out. It almost looked like a poster where you lay out the methodology, you lay out the results. Do the results match the methodology? What kind of conclusions are being drawn? To lay it out and organize it in that way makes it very easy for a peer reviewer and an editor to be able to look through a paper and say, this is a high quality paper in terms of its writing and in terms of its presentation. So those are major reasons that articles are rejected by journals. And if you look down this, these are all things that can be addressed by the authors before it's ever submitted in the first place. There are also reasons that rejections happen that are out of your control. And authors need to recognize this. Oftentimes they're being rejected not necessarily because of the quality of the paper, but for other reasons. One of them traditionally has been space limitations. There's simply too many submissions for the space that's in a particular journal. Online journals have reduced this challenge quite a bit. It's much easier now for journals, especially open access journals, to accept quality papers regardless of the page numbers, regardless of the other submissions and those types of things. So, online journals have really helped in terms of reducing that challenge of space limitations. On occasion, you will get peer reviews that are poor quality. It does happen. It can be for a number of reasons. Sometimes the reviewer is not an expert in the field. They may be generally in that area, but there may be some methodologies or other things that they don't understand. It could be that philosophically someone has a difference of opinion in terms of how a particular mechanism works, or in how a particular methodology might be related to an outcome. It's appropriate for the author to discuss those types of reviews with the editor. And I think it's important for the author to contact the editor and talk about that if the author feels like there was a particularly poor review. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the reviewers were poor. If that happens, again, it's important to talk to the editor about it, but you don't, as the author, you don't want to be combative about it. You don't want to be confrontational, particularly if the decision doesn't go your way. And you never, ever, as an author, want to take the opportunity of responding to a peer review to try and get into a debate with the peer reviewer. That will never go your way. And it's just going to take up a lot of time, and it's going to irritate a lot of people. Also keep in mind that as an author, if you're rejected by one journal and you submit your manuscript to another journal, that does not mean, especially in fields that are relatively small, it doesn't mean that when you submit to another journal, you're going to get different reviewers. Very often, you'll have the same reviewers that review for different journals, and if it's someone who is very closely related to your work, if it's someone who's in your field, you might get the same reviewers for the second submission. So keep in mind, you don't want to get into arguments with editors, and you don't want to get into debates with peer reviewers, because you're probably going to see them again down the road. Another reason that rejections happen that are really out of your control is simply that in general science, very high impact journals, the majority of submissions are rejected. There are volume constraints in what they can publish, and there simply isn't enough space to be, and especially time-wise, there isn't enough space and there isn't enough rapid peer review to be able to cover all of the submissions. Science and Nature get over 10,000 submissions a year. Most of those are rejected by the editor immediately, and most of those are rejected in 24 to 48 hours. Some societies do the same thing. Some society journals who have to cover multiple disciplines will have a particular amount of space in each issue for each discipline. And so if you are submitting to one of these society journals, oftentimes they will reject your paper simply because they already have papers in the docket to try and publish for a particular section of the journal that's based on discipline. Some journals will reject submissions requiring major revisions. And this happens more and more now because there's so many submissions happening. But if a paper comes back from peer review and all of the peer reviewers are in agreement that there needs to be major revision, particularly additional data that needs to be collected, oftentimes editors will reject the paper outright. And on occasion, what you will find is that an editor or a peer reviewer will feel like that there's a paper that's just too close, too similar to a recent publication in that journal. Or the editor knows that there's a manuscript that's in press in that journal that is going to be very similar to a submission. And for that reason, oftentimes papers are rejected. Keep in mind also that you're probably not going to know that. That's going to be something that is in the editor's mind, but it's not something that they're going to put into the review that's sent to you. That there may be another paper that's coming out that's showing very similar results. So all of these are things that happen on a regular basis. They're very frustrating for authors, and I think they all sort of lead to that idea that the editorial process is a black hole, because oftentimes you'll get reviews that don't look terrible. They might look not, okay, not good, but okay, but the paper's rejected outright. And oftentimes it's one of these types of issues that are happening that's really resulting in weighing that paper towards rejection through the editorial process. So keep in mind that many of the things that papers are rejected for that I showed in the previous slide can be addressed by the authors before they ever submit the paper. These are things that really can't be addressed by the author, but they're out there, they're real, and they do have an impact on the likelihood of papers being rejected or accepted. Having said all of that, how do you optimize your chances for acceptance? And these are some things that I think authors should know, especially junior authors, junior scientists that are coming in. They're trying to get papers published for the first time. They don't really understand the process. there are things that you can do to really increase your chances of acceptance. Number one, by far the most important, is simply pick an appropriate journal for submission. Go online, look and see what the aims and the scope of the journal are. As Dr. Ruiz said, pull some of the papers that have been published recently, see how they look, see what they're talking about. One of the things that you see happen often is what I call cascading, which means that someone will write a paper and they'll send it to a journal like Science and Nature, and oftentimes you'll hear them say it's no problem because they're going to reject it or move it on to peer review in the first 24 to 48 hours, so I've only lost a couple of days. So they'll send it to Science or Nature, it'll be rejected by them, it comes back, and then they say, okay, let's send it to another general science journal that's not of quite as high a quality, and then they start working their way down the list until someone finally sends it out for peer review and it's accepted. And it may change style along the way. It's a lot easier now to change reference formats and doing those kinds of things, which has really led more to this cascading. But if you look at the data on cascading, what you find is that it really doesn't have much of an impact in terms of where the paper is finally accepted. And so it really is just wasting time to do that. So again, I come back to spend the time, pick the appropriate journal, perhaps talk to the editor about the aims and the scope and whether the topic of your paper might be of interest. And then pick one. You want to pick something that's of high impact factor if possible, but more importantly, you want to match your paper to the journal. Secondly, write a clear and descriptive title. I tell my students and mentees all the time, don't write your title in the format of a question. You want the title to be descriptive of what happened, what did you do, why did you do it, and what did you find. You want that to be in the title. And you want your research question to be obvious. You want the question stated in the abstract, and you want the question stated in the introduction. If an editor is doing the initial review and looks at the title and looks at the abstract and then spends the time to look at the introduction and still doesn't know what question you're asking, you are very likely going to get an initial editorial rejection. So make sure that the editor and make sure that the reviewers don't have to look for the question. Make sure they know what the question is initially as they start to read the paper. Another thing is to comply with instructions for authors. Many people will submit papers thinking that they will fix formatting after the submission is accepted. And that doesn't happen very often because editors will reject it if it's not in the right format because they don't want to waste the time of the peer reviewers. So don't do that. Don't think that I will submit this as it is, and when the peer review comes back, they'll talk about the fact that my references are in the wrong format, or my figures are in the wrong format, or somehow that the instructions weren't followed, but that's okay. I can fix that after they accept my paper because you're really reducing the chances that you will get an acceptance from that journal. And lastly, something that we don't hear about too much, but something that authors really need to think about is writing a very strong cover letter. Remember, when you're submitting to a journal, it's going to go to an editor who is probably not an expert in that specific area. So it's important to tell that editor what the research question is, how it fits the scope of the journal, and then you want to talk about the results in terms of how does this fit broadly into the context of significant work that's going on in that field. And you want to put those things in a cover letter. The cover letter shouldn't simply say, I'm submitting this paper to you, thank you very much. You need to talk a little bit. You need to explain to the editor why the editor is going to be interested in that paper and why the readership of that journal is going to be interested in the paper. And the higher impact factor you go in terms of journal submissions, the more important it is to have this strong cover letter. I would also suggest very strongly that in your cover letter, you suggest 4 to 5 potential peer reviewers. And I will tell you that myself certainly and other editors who I know will take those suggestions seriously. The situation that you don't want to be put in is to have the editor or have a section editor look down your reference list at authors who you've referenced and pick their names. And that's typically what happens if there aren't peer reviewers who are being used regularly by that journal in a particular area. The editor will look down your reference list and pick names of authors from your references. You don't want to do that. So it's important to tell the editor, here are peer reviewers in the field who will understand my work and understand how my work fits into the significance of the greater body of literature. And I will tell you that editors will pay attention to those recommendations. Another part of that, the flip side of that, is if there are reasons that you don't want someone to be a peer reviewer, you need to tell the editor. Editors respect that. Editors welcome that. If you have a competitor who you don't want to see your work before it's published, if you have proprietary information that you don't want people to see until it's published, or if you have a competitor who is just philosophically opposed to your methodologies or the ways that you interpret your results, those types of things, it's important to tell the editor that. But you need to tell the editor, if you don't want someone to be chosen as a peer reviewer, you need to tell the editor why. Don't just say, I'd rather this person not be it. You need to say, it's because this is a competitor who I'd rather not see my results until it's published. So those are 5 things that you can do to really enhance the chances of acceptance by a journal, especially a higher impact factor journal. And lastly, I would leave you with this. I learned this when I was a student, and I have told all of my students this. Every manuscript has a home. Now, it may take time to find the home, and there are likely going to be major revisions along the way. But don't get frustrated and stop looking. Especially junior investigators, oftentimes they will get a really bad rejection letter, and they will take the work and stick it in their file cabinet and either forget about it or come back to it months later. Don't do that. Keep looking for that home, because I promise you it's out there, and you can get the paper published if it's a quality paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm gonna go ahead and start asking some of the questions that we have. One question that did come up a couple times, I think. Do you prepare or plan where you're gonna submit your paper before you start writing the paper or after you write the paper? And why?
Well, I would suggest to think about the target journal on beforehand. That will be the best. And of course, always being realistic on where can you get your paper published. But if you choose the journal before start writing, then you can adapt a lot of the style and wording to the text to the journal you are aiming for.
I would agree with that, and Dr. Ruiz might want to comment on this. As you develop as a scientist, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what journals are going to be interested in your work to start with. Hopefully there'll be 4 or 5 high-impact journals in which you publish on a regular basis. So as you go along, as you develop as a scientist, you won't spend as much time having to really think about what type of journal you want to publish in. You're going to know when you ask the question, particularly if a student brings a draft to you, as you read that draft and you're working with the student, it's going to come to you relatively quickly of which journal is going to be of interest. I would also follow up with this. It's good to try and build relationships with editors. You know, talk to editors, email editors. If you get a chance at scientific meetings to go to the booths for journals, oftentimes the editors are there. You want to try and build relationships with them. You want them to know your name when your work comes across their desk. And one of the ways you do that is simply by submitting your work over and over again to the same journals, the journals that are going to be that are going to see your work as high interest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next question that I think also came up in 3 different ways from our audience. If you have a big paper that you want to publish with multiple components, and you are challenged by the word limit. Would you advise on splitting the paper into two and being more concise and losing maybe depth from having one paper, everything in one paper, or how would you handle that?
Yeah, sometimes the decision of where is the frontier between one paper or two, it's not so so clear, and it's not so easy. But if you have doubts, then I will recommend to go for one paper. And if there is a word limit, word limitations, then what I will suggest is to put a lot of emphasis on your main research question and to try to summarize elegantly the other set of results, and to use the supplementary file option, where you can extend and upload additional analysis, details on methodology, and some other supporting information that is not really important to understand the flow of the paper, but that it supports the information that is given in the main paper. We have many examples in papers published in Nature or New England Journal of Medicine or Cell or Science, where they have 4 pages, printed pages, and then they have 20 pages as a supplementary file, where they provide all the supporting information that comes into these 4 main pages.
And I would add to that, sometimes you can talk to an editor about having partner papers published in a particular issue. It's not unusual to see a paper part A and part B, or papers with different titles. It's important, though, to make sure the editor understands that these papers need to be reviewed together and they need to be published in the same issue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There was one question, I think, by one of our audience members that had to leave, but I'll ask her question, and if we can communicate with her that question was answered. How many papers are recommended for publication during a PhD? And what is the highest impact factor that a PhD student should be aiming for?
Well, there's no clear answer for that. How many papers? I'm not sure. It may depend on the institution where you are defending your PhD, on the requirements, and but for sure, when it comes to the impact factor, the highest, the better. The higher, the better. There are many PhDs defended with the papers in Nature, in Cell, or Science, and this is the best. Of course, it can happen to you. And how many papers? It really depends. If you have 1 paper in Science or 2 papers, one in Science and 1 in Nature, I think it's more than enough, because I'm sure that there you put a lot of efforts and most likely 3-4 years on getting these papers published. So it really depends on your lab, on your mentor, on the institutions where you are, also on the type of research you are doing. If you are doing more epidemiological studies, maybe the chances to get more papers published are higher than if you are working on more basic science, when you have to take care of cells or animal models studies, where things get much more slower, but they are, the merit is the same or even higher. So it really depends on the topic. It really depends on the area you are working on.
I would also add that it depends to some degree on what your career goals are.
True.
If you're looking for a high-powered postdoc at a major international research institution, the expectations for publication for someone coming in as a postdoc would be higher than for someone who's going to be at an institution that has higher teaching loads and expectations of instructional work and those types of things.
Yeah, totally agree. Yes, hello? Seems that Patrick is off.
I would follow up by saying that a student should know by talking to their advisor, talking to their to their committee members about what the expectations are.
Yeah.
So I see that Patrick has, well, is freezed, but it's now 7 p.m. So it's time, and this is Antonio that is speaking. So I suggest that we try to answer some of these questions offline, and we will post them close to the YouTube video and to the events session or a section of our websites. So I really wanted to Patrick to do this, but I want to thank Greg and Jonathan for doing this. It was a great webinar and very insightful for a young researcher. But you have to be the ones that cover your do your research and make your own way. Don't expect anyone to lead you all the way. I don't know if Greg or Jonathan want to say something else.
Well, just a few words to finish. Good luck with your research. Remember that, especially when you are starting your career, there is no time in the watch and no days on your calendar. Somebody told me once that science never sleeps, and that there are no secrets. The only thing that counts is hard work and read a lot to get good ideas. So yeah, be patient, be motivated. The best thing that can happen to you is to find to work in a field that really gets you motivated, and that and to get to be hungry of learning and to be hungry of publishing. I think that's the best thing that can happen to you, and to have a very good group of collaborators. Very good of collaborators, very tough with your papers, but very constructive. Because the tougher they are, the more you will learn, and the less comments you will get from the reviewers, and the higher chances you will get to get your paper published.
And I would just add to that it is an honor and a privilege to be a part of the scientific community. So make sure that you're having fun while you're doing science.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for both of your times. I'm sorry I lost connection for a moment there, but I heard the last bit. Again, thank you for your time, and my best wishes to everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.